Good evening. It is a real pleasure. The Institute for Human Sciences is absolutely delighted to be welcoming our very special guest this evening, Jake Sullivan, who is, of course, the former National Security Advisor to the United States to the previous administration of Joseph Biden. So this promises to be an absolutely fascinating evening. We have entitled it Beyond the Headlines, Current Structural Trends in Global Politics, and you will learn about those first of all in a fireside chat, metaphorically speaking, with Ivan Krastev, and we're obviously at a what they now call an inflection point in global politics. So much is happening. I don't know if you're the same as me, but I wake up every morning and begin my doom scrolling early on. And I am struggling to try and understand all the processes that are now underway around the globe, but I am very confident that Jake Sullivan is going to help us understand precisely where we are and where we're heading. I would like to introduce a few people who are here tonight. The Ambassador of Liechtenstein, Maria Pia Kotbauer, is with us, as is Ursula Plasnik, former Foreign Minister of Austria, and finally Wolfgang Schüssel, who is the former Federal Chancellor of Austria. Welcome to you and welcome everybody else. And I would also like to highlight, before handing over to Ivan, that the sponsor of today's events is the Federal Ministry of Defense, who sponsor all our geopolitical talks and with whom we have an extremely fruitful relationship. So thank you very much indeed. After the fireside chat between Ivan and Jake Sullivan, you will all have the opportunity to ask questions. So, without further ado, let me hand you over to Ivan Krastev, our permanent fellow at the IWM.
Thank you very much, and we really see this as a unique opportunity to the extent that we even have not decided how we're going to put it on YouTube, because we want to have a conversation which is as open as possible. And while you're here because you know who is Jake Sullivan, not because you don't know, but I'm going to give you three things about his biography which could be interesting for you. One is because we talk about the crisis of meritocracy. In a certain way, his story is meritocracy on steroids. Yale, Oxford, the ever youngest head of the policy planning department in the American history, the ever youngest national security advisor. Now basically somebody who is having the Kissinger chair in the Harvard University. But from our point of view, what was particularly interesting for me is that he was the American foreign policy thinker and practitioner who, after 2016, put most effort to understand what happened and what should change. So from this point of view, if there is somebody who believes in grand strategy, it's him, for good or for bad. And as a result of it, my idea is really to try to go back to some of the assumptions and to our thinking. In 2016, after basically Hillary Clinton lost the elections and he was the major foreign policy advisor to the Clinton's campaign, he decided to go to a kind of a thorough analysis of what is wrong. And one of the major stories that he got wrong is that in America there was a certain elite consensus about foreign policy, but there was not constituency for it. People were not there, and he comes with the idea of foreign policy for the middle class. I'm sure that basically President Trump is going to subscribe for the version for the foreign policy of the middle class. So this is why my first question is, now when you look back and when basically everybody believes that the foreign policy should be much more focused on foreign policy that people can subscribe for? Where are the similarities and where are dissimilarities with this administration?
First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm grateful. Thanks to everybody for coming out. I'm looking forward to a good conversation tonight. I think really there are two central propositions that are common across the two parties when it comes to foreign policy and national security. The first is that the intersection of foreign policy and domestic policy has become much tighter and much more relevant, and that requires an industrial strategy focused on reviving America's industrial and innovation base in key sectors. It involves needing supply chain resilience, so we're not dependent on any country or group of countries for critical goods, as we learned that we were after COVID. It requires pushing back against unfair practices. The one we were most focused on in our administration was Chinese overcapacity and the flooding of the market with low-cost goods that was distorting markets and creating unfair competition. Something, by the way, that's not just about the United States. That's a story that affects Brazil, Turkey, the European Union, and many other countries that also impose various measures against China. So first you have this entangling of foreign and domestic policy that is common across the two parties. And the second is, after 2016, the era of engagement of a view of China which said, we will bring them into the international system and they will become more like us, gave way to an era that said we are in an intense competition across multiple domains with the People's Republic of China, and we need to prosecute that competition vigorously, even as we manage it carefully so it doesn't tip into conflict. That too has a commonality across the two parties. I would say the single biggest difference in the foreign policy realm is that at the center of the story in the Biden administration were allies. We work together with like-minded democracies from Europe, Asia, and elsewhere on a common strategy to increase our collective productive capacity and to compete effectively with China. And the story of the Trump administration, I think, devalues allies, sees them more as a liability than an asset. And so that's a sharp distinction between the two administrations.
So let's be a devil's advocate on this, and because it's very important. In one of the articles that Jake Sullivan published in Foreign Affairs before entering office, he said one of the biggest mistakes could be to try to see the relations with China as a Cold War. He said for two reasons. On one level, because it's exaggerating the existential nature of the threat, but secondly, because this dismisses the strengths of Beijing. I'm saying this because can you argue in favor of the Trump's view that the very fact that you have this type of alliances is making any type of relations with China very much a Cold War frame?
Well, first, anytime Ivan starts a question with "let me play devil's advocate," you should get very nervous. Just that's a pro tip from someone who's known him for many years and been just extremely impressed with the incisiveness of his thinking and his questioning. We're talking about NATO. We're talking about our alliances with Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines. Those alliances have existed for decades. Those alliances in the Asia Pacific helped create the stability and the lack of great power conflict that enabled China's remarkable rise. So somehow I find it ironic for China to argue, or for Ivan Krastev to argue, or the devil in Ivan Krastev to argue, that the alliances are inconsistent with a world in which the United States and China can live alongside one another as major powers. We have done so for decades. Now, China has a choice to make too in this regard. And I think this is important because one of the features of modern geopolitics is a growing alignment among China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I think Russia would like a new Cold War. with the United States in a lot of respects if they can't cut a deal with Trump. But for the longer term, I think Putin sees basically a hostile relationship with the West. I think North Korea would like that too. Iran is a bit more tactical. China has a choice to make. Does it want to avoid bloc confrontation, or is it going to go deeper into that entanglement? So from my perspective, the major thing that has changed since Xi Jinping came to power is not US policy towards its alliances, but rather PRC policy in the region and more broadly. And I'll make one more point. The PRC has engaged in the largest peacetime buildup of military power. Peacetime buildup. It's not in a war or coming out of a war. In human history, I would argue. Why? Why? Now, the PRC would give you a lot of answers for that, but it's, to me, decisions in Beijing much more than decisions in Washington that have reshaped the environment in the Indo-Pacific. And it certainly is not the American alliance system, which has been around for quite a long time, and which, honestly, if I were the PRC, I would look back at the period where that alliance system played such a central role in creating the very conditions that they relied upon to have the period of extraordinary growth they went through.
Thank you very much. But continuing this, because when I was arguing as a devil's advocate, I was much more arguing for Trump's position than for the Chinese position. And the argument will go like this. In 2018, you wrote, in my view, really very important article saying, listen, Russia has an intention to destroy the liberal order, but they don't have the capacities. China has the capacities, but they don't have the intention. So from this point of view, he said, if they're going to be a next democratic administration, it's very important to try to defend this liberal order. We should not give up on this. In my view, if I'm trying to basically make an argument for President Trump, and believe me, he didn't authorize me to do it, it's going to look like this. The international liberal order was already basically beyond repair in 1918. So if they're going to be moment of disorder, better take the initiative and try to be the creative disorder than basically being the one who is going to be on the receiving part of it, because you're going to have still the initiative and try to open certain room for maneuvering. And what is particularly important, and I do believe that this was on the level of his instincts, he said, the fact that you have these alliances in a moment of a very kind of increasing competition makes America not so much the hegemon, but the hostage. Some of your kind of allies, which are much more kind of disturbed by certain developments, can push you in a situation in which you don't want to go. So America should try to free itself of your alliances in order to be able to reshape the world, which is going to be very different from the world that we have been in. I'm saying this because after having your article, you have been for 4 years been in the Situation Room, so it was not about writing articles. Do you believe that betting on defending liberal order when Biden came to power was the best strategy, or probably it was kind of beyond repair after many things, but also after the first Trump administration, honestly speaking?
So in one of those articles I wrote in 2018, I actually, near the top, started with an anecdote about the liberal international order. I was in Ohio during the 2016 campaign giving remarks to a group of people, and I used the phrase liberal international order, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know what that means, but I don't like any of those 3 words. Okay? And I actually said in the piece, you're not going to hear me using that phrase, and I did not use it as national security advisor. In fact, the first statement of the national security strategy that we published said, the post-Cold War era is over. So you have the Cold War period, you have the post-Cold War period, and then you have now. And what is now? Well, a vigorous competition is underway for what now is. And my argument would be that if you look at America's distinctive advantages in a competition with the PRC, but also in trying to solve big problems that afflict us all, whether it's the climate crisis or managing the risks of artificial intelligence or nuclear proliferation. One of our distinctive advantages is a network of capable allies. And I would look at our balance sheet and say, we're 25% of the world's GDP. If you combine us with Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, Canada, Mexico, others, we're well more than half the world's GDP. There's a lot of leverage to shape the future when it comes to trade, to technology, and it's a heck of a lot of leverage to go after, with vigor, the great transnational challenges of our time. So for me, I don't look at those alliances from a hostage perspective, a liability perspective. I look at it from, man, that is an asset that nobody else has. And why, in God's name, would we give all that away, or worse, actively seek to fight with or alienate our allies when we're in this kind of competition? And we can call upon those strengths in a way that the PRC cannot. And then the other point that I would make in response to this proposition that allies drag you into war, I would just say we have a historical record. And the historical record for NATO is that it was a central feature of the European security architecture through the Soviet era, and it has been through the Putin era. And I believe it is a massive contributor to us not having had a great power war, which was a repeated feature of the European continent pre-1945. So I actually think, I understand the argument about how, an ally, moral hazard, can drag the bigger power into war. I understand that in a textbook. In the real world, I see the fact of the Article 5 guarantee actually providing a significant deterrent and helping ensure that the US and Russia don't end up in direct combat. And so I just come from a different point of view in terms of the range and nature of alliances. So if you ask me, will I defend the American alliance system and the basic notion of alliances as a core pillar of American statecraft? I absolutely will. Do they have to be updated and modernized? Yes. Should we ask our allies to share a greater part of the burden? Yes. In the Biden administration, when we came into office, 9 NATO allies were spending 2% on GDP, of their GDP on defense. When we left, it was 23. So, we put our money where our mouth was, or really these countries put their money where their mouth was. But am I going to sit here and say, no, we need to defend the liberal international order? I'm not going to say that. I think we do need a rethinking, including a rethinking of where the transatlantic relationship goes from here. But I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And then I'll go to concrete policies, because in a certain way, I do believe one of the things about Biden administration is that it was very strategic. You can like or dislike, from outside, but the level of consistencies of policies, and your policy was very much focusing on China, on everything, starting with technology, trying to park Russia, and very much try to reduce basically the tensions there, and also trying basically to get America out of a never-ending wars, which was a huge problem for basically American public. And here comes Afghanistan, and I'm not even talking, honestly speaking, about how it worked, because it's events. I'm very much saying, to what extent you're ready to agree with those who believes that, for example, President Putin read the decisions to withdraw from Afghanistan as a kind of encouragement, saying Americans are really going to focus only on China. If I'm decided to have a successful special operation in Ukraine, it's going to be a local conflict, and probably they're not going to react very strongly on this.
I would love to see the archives open in Russia, for things that I don't know, to see, because look, I have the humility to say I don't fully know the answer to that question. Obviously, I can't speak with absolute authority about what was in Putin's mind in contributing to his decision. But I do think we have some data points to suggest that the decision to invade Ukraine was made long before August of 2021. First, Putin did a big military buildup on the border of Ukraine in the early part of 21. People have kind of forgotten this. A massive buildup, to the point where we believed he was going in. And the reason that Joe Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June of 21, that was a summit offered to actually try to deal with the Ukraine crisis. Second, in July, after that summit, Putin comes out with his manifesto, basically saying Ukraine is not its own country, laying the intellectual, philosophical predicate, perverse as it was, for the invasion. Third, remember, I can't say everything about the intelligence picture we were developing, but I can say this based on what has been declassified. We came out in November basically saying Russia's going to invade. That was based on a pattern of intelligence we had built over some time. The idea that Russia invented an invasion plan, built it, constructed to send people out from the end of August to say, the end of September is illogical and implausible. So I think these events were set in motion long before then. My personal view is that Putin made this decision during COVID for a variety of reasons. And then he was just going off to execute it. But I do not think Afghanistan played a huge role. That being said, history will tell us more than I can say from this stage today.
No, I very much tend to agree, and also probably some people has heard me saying this here, but I really do believe that one of the things that globally we're totally underestimating is the impact of COVID on the political thinking globally. Economic thinking, where you suddenly certain things that were unthinkable happened. Listen, if you're a green activist and you have been dreaming that all planes are going to be landed in a day, you have your day. And if you're a right-wing activist and you wanted all the borders to be closed in a day, you had the day. All this happened. But for me, and of course, in my view, there was a very strong demographic anxiety on the Russian side for doing this, and I was always believing that it was much more about population than about land. But I'm saying this because suddenly you have this China-focused strategy based on alliances, and it was very much alliances about economy, about technology. Yep. If there's going to be a new war, it's going to be a technological war. And then suddenly come events. Yep. War in Ukraine. What was the major framework in which you were seeing this? Because interestingly enough, when you talk, for example, to people around Trump, and if you talk to the European leaders, and if you ask what are the comparisons, the analogies that they work with, Europeans, particularly Balts or Poles, we're going to say, we are back in 1938. Trump people are going to tell you, we're in 1914. It's about sleepwalking in a big war. What was the comparisons you have been working with?
I actually took a course in college calling Making Foreign Policy by Historical Analogy. And it was based on a book written by a professor at Oxford named Yong-Fung Kong. And essentially his argument is don't make foreign policy by historical analogy. Okay. So follow history, know history, read history, but be careful to analogize. So I don't think that the moment for me was either 1914 or 1938, though the risks of each were real. I believe the risk that if Putin had taken all of Ukraine, that his appetite would have been whetted for more and pressure on NATO would have come, was real. I also believe that if we all reflexively react without any consideration whatsoever of the possibility of escalation, that you could sleepwalk into direct conflict between major powers. I believe both of those things. And in fact, I think that's what guided our policy. On the one hand, be stalwart and resolute in standing up for and standing behind Ukraine. On the other hand, recognize, but don't be paralyzed by escalation risk and try to manage for that. Now, there are those who, on the one hand, say, all you did was court World War III, and therefore you're warmongers. And there are those on the other side who say, you self-deterred because you were worried about World War III, and you should have gone much further in pressing Russia, or in, helping Ukraine attack Russia and so forth. My view on this is that we had to chart a path that was consistent, strong, ambitious levels of support for Ukraine, and avoid anything that would tip this over into a conflict that ended up engulfing all of us. That's what we tried to do. I believe that's what we did. And in fact, if you go back to January of 2021, and you say, Kyiv will stand, the Ukrainian people will stand as a free and independent people and a free and independent nation. Russia will be trying to grind out meters and yards in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine is consolidated as a democracy and a society. It has an orientation to the West, and we did not end up in World War III. I'd say that is not everything any of us would have wanted, but that's, I think, a series of steps that we took that we can be very proud of.
Thank you very much. And then comes my question, because on talks like this, there are two things that you should not do. Push the person to defend basically the record of his government or to criticize the next government. But if you're coming from there, where you see kind of the pluses and the minuses of the way the current American administration deals with Ukraine, what you're going to see as an opportunity and what you're seeing basically as something that you would not have done.
I'll just be brief on this because I don't, to the point of the preface to the question, want to spend my time as what we call in the United States of America an armchair quarterback or a backseat driver. I certainly dealt with a lot of those people when I was in the seat, so I don't want to do it as much. I find two things very strange. One, why make a series of concessions up front before you're even in a real negotiation? And I think the Trump administration did that. And two, at various points, President Trump has basically adopted the Russian narrative of this war. Ukraine started it. Ukraine is the obstacle to ending it. Now, I think President Trump has adjusted course to a certain extent, partly because President Zelensky and he had a mano-a-mano, a tete-a-tete in the Vatican. And I think that had a real impact on President Trump. And since then, his approach, and we've seen it just in the last hour, of trying to actually put some amount of public pressure on Russia to show up at the table in a serious way, to accept a ceasefire in a serious way, that would be good. But at the end of the day, I worry, let's see what happens this week, who knows, on Thursday, peace could break out. But I worry that unless President Putin believes that President Trump's going to follow through and actually impose additional sanctions or other forms of pressure, he's going to continue to evade. I worry about that as a risk. And so I hope that President Trump, if that happens, is prepared to follow through with the threats he's made about imposing escalating pressure on Russia. That, I think, is the critical next step. If Putin doesn't this week somehow come to the table in a serious way, and I have no way to predict sitting here now what's going to happen even by the end of this week.
Thank you very much. When he said that he does not want to be a backseat driver, in one of the profiles that I was reading about Jake Sullivan, and as I said, people were saying how super achiever he was. One of the questions was what he's doing badly. And the answer was he's a very bad driver. But then comes my next question, and it's very much, there's going to be some compromise at the end. If they're going, which compromise you're going perceived as a fair and just, thinking in terms of strategic stability of Europe, based on the reality of the ground, not on what we want to, and what is going to be one that is going to really worry you? Because in my view, this is a kind of we all talk about that they should be compromised and they should be kind of a situation which is going to stabilize or destabilize Europe on the basis of what's going to happen in Ukraine. But it's not easy to decide what we're really fighting for. For example, Europeans, outside of the Ukraine, for them keeping the big European army, Ukrainian army is a huge priority. To be honest, we perceive Ukrainian army very much as part of the European defense. And secondly, of course, Europe is very much afraid that there can be a bad deal which is going to end up with a major migration wave outside of Ukraine, which can create a huge political crisis in Europe. Ukrainians, I can understand that for them, basically, what is a good deal and what is a bad deal, even on the level of realistic, is going to be totally different because it comes to many things. This is their life. If you're going to look strategically, not from point of view of Europe or Ukraine or Russia, what type of deal you look around and said, because of this deal, I feel less worried about Europe in the next decade?
Look, I think even the Ukrainian leadership has acknowledged that de facto, there's going to have to be some understanding reach around territory. But where I think the danger lies is in the proposal of the current administration, American administration, to say, we, the United States, will formally recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Something, by the way, not even China has done. So the US all of a sudden is going to take a more pro-Russian position than the Chinese and many other countries around the world who've not recognized that. And that is because I do believe that as a matter of principle, whatever the practicalities of the resolution of this war, we must hold on to the fact that you cannot legitimize the seizure of territory by force or coercion from one country by another. And then the other thing that concerns me quite gravely is the demand the Russians are making, which they will have to, I think, ultimately concede on, that there be, to your point, a limit on the amount of military capability Ukraine can have, which is what was at the center of their Istanbul proposals from 2022. Basically, not just a neutral Ukraine in the eyes of the Russians, but a neutered Ukraine in the eyes of the Russians. This, I think, is going to be a recipe ultimately for the war to restart. And it will also teach a very bad lesson about what a war of conquest like this can generate in terms of neutering your neighbor. So that's something that I very much worry about as well.
And then going to China, which was obviously something on which you put a lot of thinking. And your formulation was that we are going to see a major competition, but this is a competition in the totally interdependent world, very different than the logic which was during the Cold War. How, for somebody who is not a specialist on China and who is not a specialist on the United States, we can follow who wins in this competition? Because part of the story being from outside, seeing how much it is on the level of technology, when we basically can have the feeling that the United States succeed to shape the relations with China in the way it wants. And by the way, one of the important messages coming out of the writings of Jake Sullivan during this period, 2016-20, it was, we're not about regime change in China. We know we're going to live with China in the way it is to a long period of time. So we don't expect China to be the next Soviet Union and just saying when it's going to happen. But then when you're going to believe that you have reached a level, particularly because of the tensions that we see now, which is going to make others feel comfortable about the level of stability and stable competition, which is not going to end up either of China taking the upper hand or of kind of a major crisis that is going to destroy everything.
One of the other points I made in that foreign affairs piece and that I lived with every day as national security advisor is I don't think there is an end state to US-China relations where everybody can say, okay, now somebody won and somebody lost and either we had Armageddon or we didn't. I think we are going to be in a steady state of competition with the lurking risk that competition devolves into conflict or confrontation. That risk needs to be managed, and that competition will play out in every domain and in different ways, in different domains. Diplomatic influence in international institutions, overall economic power and capacity, who is leading on the key technologies of the future, and then what is the nature of the correlation of forces and deterrence and power in the military domain, particularly in the Western Pacific. Those are some of the ways in which this competition will play out. And the competition will be long-term, and the management of the risk that the competition spills into conflict will be long-term, and intense competition requires intense diplomacy. So I spent, including right here in Vienna, more than 50 hours in multiple sessions around the world with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. And we would sit for 2 days at a time, 12 hours over those 2 days, and we would work through every significant issue in the relationship as part of an intense diplomatic effort to manage the competition effectively. It's going to require that level of continuing effort 5 years from now, and I would argue, 25 years from now, because I don't think China's going anywhere, and we're not going anywhere. So we're going to have to learn to live alongside one another as major powers. And beyond that, the US and China are going to have to work together when it comes to certain issues that pose an existential threat to us both. One of them, in my view, is even as we're racing for who leads at the frontier of artificial intelligence, both of us have to sit together to talk about managing the risk posed to humanity by the advancing capabilities of artificial intelligence. None of that can be easily kind of boiled down to a bumper sticker. None of it is as emotionally satisfying as some of the moments of the Cold War, but that is the reality that we have to live with, and that is and facing that reality square and then trying to manage it as effectively as possible. I think that is our collective charge. And here again, I think allies and partners are vital. Conducting this exercise with coordination and alignment to the maximum extent possible with like-minded countries, to me, is central to the success of this strategy. And the more that we are eroding trust and confidence in those alliances and partnerships, the more we are putting ourselves in a disadvantaged position vis-a-vis China.
Thank you. Because for me, there are two things that, to be honest, worried me, and I'll go. One is when you go back to the Cold War and try to understand why it never became hot, one of the reasons is that both sides believe that the future is on their side. Ideologically, basically, the Soviet Union believes that the world is moving towards communism, and this is kind of a natural law based on economic developments and others. And the United States, and this was very much the Cannon's containment, was that, in fact, the future does not belong to the Soviets. The Soviet Union is going to end up destroyed by its own contradictions. No. So if you believe that future is on your side, you believe that if there's going to be a clash, better do it tomorrow. You're going to be stronger. I'm very much afraid that now, and this is something that, to be honest, I see very much coming out of the Trump administration, from time to time you have the feeling that part of the kind of actions of the American administration is as if we have the feeling that we're losing. In a certain way, we're radicalizing because we're not sure that tomorrow we're going to be in a better position. And for me, this is important because I'm going to ask you a question that probably you can answer exactly because you were sitting in a decision-making position. We normally say that democracies has advantages when it comes to authoritarian regimes, but we're saying this is a kind of as if this is true in any time and in any context. But here's my question. When you talk about this all the time negotiating, diplomacy, commanding, and want to have public on your side, in my view, what we're seeing with democracy is that democracies, because democracies are people having opinion, has two characteristics. Public tends to be emotional. When you see, for example, the war starting, people say, do something. And 3 months later, they said, go home. Basically, the same people that have been on the streets being shocked of what they saw in Ukraine, after that said, but what we're doing there? And I'm saying this because you have been thinking a lot about the realism in foreign policy. How easy it is to be a realist in a functioning democracy. And how much this kind of a normal advantage of a democracy that you can try to keep people on your side, particularly now with the social media, with a totally different information environment, is becoming the major constraint. And how you're feeling it when you're taking decisions and not simply basically when you're analyzing it in a conference halls.
You know, Ed Luce has just written a biography of Brzezinski, the national security advisor to Carter. And he called me for a piece that he wrote for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that was sort of describing Brzezinski's diplomacy with the Soviets over Poland. He was asking me to reflect on how has the job of National Security Advisor changed since Brzezinski and Kissinger's era. And it goes directly to your question. Can you imagine today an American Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, just disappearing off the face of the earth for like, I don't know, a couple weeks, putatively going to Pakistan or wherever Kissinger was supposed to be going, and really just be conducting secret talks, not over the course of hours or 2 days, but over the course of an extended period of time, and then coming out and saying, hey, by the way, we're completely radically changing our policy towards China. Everybody get on board. And how that would play out in today's media environment. I mean, it's almost hard to contemplate. So I do believe that the constraints of the modern political system, and particularly the extent to which foreign affairs is no longer insulated from the nastiest elements of our politics on all sides, is a constraining force for sustained, far-sighted, and consistent policy practiced across administrations. And I do think that that puts the United States, it creates a challenge for the United States that the PRC does not necessarily have. I think that is real. I think a second thing in a competition like we were in with China that I felt acutely during my 4 years in office is democracies have a lot of red tape and a lot of interest groups, and it is very hard to build fast and at scale in a democracy in the 21st century. China does not have that problem. And we do. Whether it's submarines or sufficient housing or strategic industries of the future. On the other hand, when we came into office in 2021, you can go online and look at these graphs. China was predicted to surpass the United States in total GDP by 2030, or shortly thereafter, or shortly before. When we left office in 2025, you go look at those graphs, and it suggests it'll be way out in the future, if ever. In fact, the US lead over China in terms of overall size of GDP grew over the time that President Biden was in office. So I do not believe that we should enter any of these conversations from the view that it's all slipping away from us. No. We have massive natural capacity and the ability to regenerate, reinvent, and we have friends. This group of friends that I've talked repeatedly about who, if we do not squander them, we can all work together and feel, yes, actually the future is on our side, not in some Manichaean existential sense, but that we will do just fine, thank you very much, if we just do the right thing, despite the difficulties that come with being in a democracy. The last point on realism, taking a position that is not absolute or ideological, that is more practical, that requires some degree of calibration and compromise, is an invitation for everybody to say, you've done it wrong. Because you can't please the people who want to be over here, and you can't please the people who want to be over there, and there's not a huge, loud constituency for doing things just practically. But nonetheless, that is, to me, the right order of things when it comes to trying to manage something as significant as the competition with China. And in the end, I think it will shine through. So I think people having conviction that you're not going to please everybody in a democracy, but you're going to stick with it, I think is a necessary part of an effective statecraft and for the US to be able to succeed.
I'm going to ask my last question, and I'm going to leave Gaza and Europe for you, because I'm sure it's going to be asked better. But my question is kind of a tabloid question. Who is the national security advisor of America's 20th or 21st century that you admire most? And who is the American president, different than Joe Biden, that you want to serve as a national security advisor to?
So it's interesting about National Security Advisor. It's probably Scowcroft, and that is partly because of his character and his temperament and the way he treated his colleagues. And I think that's a hugely important part of being a good national security advisor, but also a good person. But also, he was somebody who pursued a quite practical approach on a lot of issues. And so I think that model, that kind of character for me is something, I couldn't hope to quite emulate, but I could at least try to learn from in what I did. And then in terms of an American president, one of my heroes has always been Harry Truman, who actually didn't have a national security advisor, or actually... He did, that's right, because it was 47. He did national security, it was right. The national security advisor was created when he was president. Here was a guy who was from the middle of the country, like me, was always rooted there, but also believed that America had a critical role to play in being a force for good in the world, and also believed that we had to do that in concert and coalition with allies and partners. And so also we, at that point, had half the world's GDP, so we had really high cards. So that would have been fun to be able to be in that position with that kind of hand to play. We're in a different world today.
Thank you. And now the interesting moment starts. Please, there is a question.
Thank you very much for your...
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry.
Yes, Maurits Potappel from the Netherlands, University of Utrecht. I had a debate with a professor, he's a realist. He said religion doesn't play a role in geopolitics. Would you, from a theoretical perspective, say religion doesn't play a role in geopolitics, just on a local level? And comment, for example, on the Gaza-Israel war, if there is religion play? And also from a practical perspective, in your experience, did you at some point in the last years see religion playing really a role in the decisions you took? Thank you.
I don't think religion played a role in decisions. It's interesting. I want to answer that question on two levels. One is, does religion play a role in in geopolitics and world affairs? I mean, I don't know the theory on this, but I can tell you absolutely from where I sat in the Situation Room of the Oval Office or my office, yes, of course it does. You see that in very kind of clear examples, like the rise of certain forms of terrorism, Islamic terrorism, the Islamic State, the Taliban, you name it, who are conducting their entire endeavors in the name of religion. In Gaza, I don't think that the central question is necessarily a religious question, but obviously you have a group of people who want to wipe the Jewish state off the map, which is what brings you October 7th. And then you have the historic context of a conflict between the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian people, and everything that's played out for decades that contributed to what happened on October 7th, the combination of those two things. But your question about decisions, so I was an advisor, the president ultimately made the decisions. The president was Catholic. Did religion play any role in his decision-making? I mean, it affected who he was as a person in a way. It affected his worldview, it affected his character, it affected his history, personal history. So I can't say no role, but he never came in and said, well, as a Catholic, we're gonna do this as opposed to that. But it is a present shaping force in the individual lives of leaders and decision makers. And then it plays this more macro role, as in the case of the Islamic State. And then I would also say, just going beyond the question of religion to religious institutions. You know, I think the Russian Orthodox Church is a relevant actor in modern European security and geopolitics. So my basic view is yes, it absolutely plays a role. It plays a role in different ways depending on how you come at it, but that's where I would net out.
Stefan Lene. And then I want to see how many people, because my idea is that we want to get, okay, so Stefan, and then we are going to get all the questions. So, because I want to be sure that everybody was going to have an opportunity to ask.
Thank you. Very good talk. Thank you very much. I have a question on China. It seems to me, on the one hand, there's a lot of continuity. I think for the Trump administration, like for the Biden administration, this is the topmost issue on foreign policy. But there are big differences too. I think in your time, it was sort of a multi-dimensional rivalry, whereas for President Trump, it's very much focused on the economy and the trade deficit and all that. And there seems to be a big difference on Taiwan too. I think your boss said several times he would defend Taiwan. I think not everybody in the White House or in the State Department were very happy about his comments, because there was some degree of rowing back afterwards. But it seems to me that Trump's worldview is very different. He looks at big powers, and it's normal for big powers to have spheres of influence. It's normal for big powers to have territorial ambitions. He has territorial ambitions, and he is ready to recognize the Crimea as a Russian territory. So I would think, and I'd be interested how you assess it, that if you're President Xi, I would speed up planning to move on Taiwan.
You want me to answer that? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
Taiwan is
So
to be answered.
I do believe that President Trump sees the China challenge in a less multidimensional way. I think that is a fair statement. He's much more focused on the economic piece, but not exclusively. When it comes, for example, to the semiconductor export controls, the Trump administration recently took the step of controlling this chip called the H20, which is central to reinforcement learning. So they have built on the steps that the Biden administration took with respect to technology. Will that stick? Will that be the trend going forward? I don't know. But I don't think it's exclusive to the question of the economic relationship. When it comes to Taiwan, I think we don't know for certain what the United States would do in the event that China took a dramatic action. I can't predict what President Trump would do, in part because he is highly unpredictable. I don't think President Xi could predict either, quite. If I were Xi, would I speed up planning? No, don't go do that. But not to be glib about it, I think one of the things that they're sitting there in Beijing thinking about right at the moment is the United States has been taking actions of late that create opportunities for us to go around and say to the rest of the world, we're the responsible, stable, predictable power. Let's improve our relationships. Europe, Japan, Korea, India, anyone else. And we're going to distinguish ourselves from the current American administration by being the kind of benign player, however real that is for the longer term. So I could see a real debate in Beijing. On the one hand, hey, why not try to seize this opportunity to do something? But on the other hand, maybe our main strategic focus at the moment should actually be to try to improve our strategic position vis-a-vis a lot of countries who looked at us in America differently a year ago than they look at us today. I think that second argument will have some purchase in Beijing.
Just to support this with some public opinion data that I saw today, the view of the United States and China, which was basically, it was done last month, it appeared for the first time that China is perceived more positively all over the globe than the United States. So this is also a new reality. My idea is to go and basically go from here to there, everybody to ask the questions. You are going, I can give you to take, you have yours, and then, so please, let's start with the minister.
Ursula Plasnik, former Austrian foreign minister. I want to use the occasion to pay tribute to one of your teachers and somebody who was a teacher for many people in the world, and that's Zhou Enlai. He died last Friday. And in some of the obituaries I read that he was representing with his concept of soft power, which for me includes law and the rule of law, question mark, closed. That he is a representative of a world gone forever, gone by, that is not our world any longer. How do you see the soft power issue? Have the Europeans been the best disciples, students of Zhou Enlai, for the price of not sitting at the table? We still worry about Riyadh 2025 supplanting Yalta 1945. It's not excluded. So will we have our borders redesigned by Trump and Putin, but be world champions of soft power?
The next, yeah, please.
Anselm Spurrier, I have a Swiss accent and I live in the States. If you were a boxer and you've just been in a fight, and you've lost, where do you look to sort of reflect on your own game and to look for new ideas? What I hear very clearly is you believe in allies, you believe in certain rational thought, but where do you question yourself to open your, blind spots? Could you reflect on that? And maybe a third one is the question of the powerful feeling powerless. Could you say something to those and say, hey guys, wake up?
Thank you. Yeah, please. Yes. You go.
Nazari Stacek. Originally, I am from Ukraine and currently visiting fellow at the University of Vienna. And being Ukrainian, first of all, I want to express my appreciation and gratitude. I know that you personally contributed enormous effort to sustain Ukraine and contribute to that we actually survive and sustain. But I want a bit challenge your part of speech when you told about the need of balancing to avoid the Third World War and a need to sustain Ukraine. Actually, when we are now following the strategy or behavior of Trump, we see that he actually also does not want to offend somehow Putin. He actually treats him more or less friendly. And actually, I think that the reason behind that is that actually he is following the same strategy as previous administration, like avoiding the threats of escalating conflict globally, and of course maybe continue to survive Ukraine. And my question is, what would you recommend actually if you are, we cannot imagine that, but if you are a security advisor for current Trump administration, what he should do better than that he is doing now? Thank you.
Thank you. Please, yeah. So, by the way, as you know, the President Trump is in a search of a next national security advisor.
Yes, he doesn't have one. That's true.
Yeah.
John Hennenfent, lawyer here. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for visiting us. And yeah, it's very reassuring to see the American meritocracy producing someone wants to give back with your intellect. And I think that's a great credit to the American system. I wish I saw more of it. Question is, Biden's policy that you articulated was a lot about partnering with democracies and so on. But how much of the strategy, if these regimes changed, Russia, Iran, China, and became more democratic, is it necessarily about regime type, or are we really talking about interests at the end of the day? This is Stephen Kotkin's whole thing. Yeah. That anyway, I'll leave it to you to answer. Thank you.
Good question.
Kirill, yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Gustav Schoen, visiting fellow here at IWM. I don't want to violate Ivan's advice, so I don't want to push you to defend the record, but genuinely interested in your reflection. In hindsight, should you have handled Gaza differently, especially in light of what the current administration is doing?
I'm Kirill Rogov. I'm from Russia and focused on Russian domestic politics, and this is the reason of my question. So I got the idea that we should not analyze foreign policy through the lenses of historical analogies. But what about domestic politics? To how much extent should we see it as a reason and the main reason for foreign policy decisions? So, and for example, speaking about Trump's foreign policy, my feeling is that before this, in Cold War era, this consensus, bipartisan consensus in American foreign policy was based on the idea that our foreign policy is firstly about values, while domestic politics is about interests. And in Trump's vision, it is vice versa, exactly. And this is the revolt of his foreign policy. Let me give me one more minute, because while you were looking at the other side, while you were discussing the reasons of Putin's invasion into Ukraine, you mentioned COVID, but I was remembering every minute that 2020 was the year when Putin changed Russian constitution. And this was not only about his next presidential term, but about changing the foundations of the constitution and about creating a new Russia, Putin's Russia instead of Yeltsin's Russia. And in this way, the invasion was mostly driven by this, in my view. And it's very interesting. What is your understanding?
Thank you. Yeah, please.
You did say that acquiring territory by force was not admissible, which is what Putin is trying to do. But you did not count this as part of the differences between your administration and the current administration, which very freely, whether or not they will do it, talks about acquiring territory, if necessary, by force. And your administration did not rescind the decision by the first Trump administration of recognizing the annexation of Golan, which was, of course, taken by force. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Mr. Sullivan, thank you very much for being with us. Last summer, in the months before the elections, I was teaching a group of American students, and you were very popular among them. And I think they would have liked very much your idea and your willingness to rethink assumptions that are often made by politicians. And therefore, I'd like to ask you a question about if you think that there is a need for politicians to rethink the language they're using. If I may explain, I think that the language of politics has for a long time been a liberal language where political decisions are justified in moral terms. And what is happening with the current administration is that this has been put to rest. But more importantly, I think that for many in the public, this liberal language has become a language of hypocrisy. You know, and I think in a way it is understandable. It can't possibly work very well for people to listen to a high moral tone at a time when they're watching pictures of babies killed in Gaza. So my question to you is, in a way, there are two questions. Do you think we can have a liberal democracy without liberal language? And do you think that politicians should actually think, or are they aware of a need to develop a new language? So,
thank you
there.
Very much. There are 2 or 3 questions more, and then you are going to have the possibility to answer all of them.
Hello, my name is Boris Krastev. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for being with us today. If I can ask two loosely related questions. Number one, in financial markets, very often changing your mind when you think you're wrong pays off very well.
Sorry, say that again.
In financial markets, very often changing your mind when you figure out you're wrong pays off quite well. In politics, it doesn't seem that's true. Correct me if I'm wrong. I would like to understand if can you actually, as a politician, especially in a sort of term mandate, right, if you figure out you're wrong midway, does it make sense? Does it add value to change your mind and reverse policies? And if you can give any examples of that, failures and success of such actions, doesn't have to be in the US, also elsewhere. And the second question is, very often a career in politics is considered for people who already have had academic success or business success, so something which comes later in life. If a young person wants to go into university and study politics and then go actively into politics, is that something which makes sense currently in this environment, looking forward the next, let's say, 10 years or 15 years? Can they somehow, what can they learn basically which will be valuable to them in a political career if 15 or 20 years later, right, in this changing world? Thank you very much.
There was one question here. The last one is.
Thank you. Name's Adrian Kreuzspiegel. My question is also with regards to China, about one aspect of your China policy, which went by the notion of small yard, high fence. Essentially, it was about saying that China can continue develop economically, but not with respect to certain technologies, not AI, not chips, not some others. What is the sort of policy response or position that China could conceivably take or should take as a response to this policy? I mean, they were not going to say like, okay, no AI for us. This is where we will give up. What policy could they conceivably pursue as a response to this? Or what would it be if you could choose? Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
He has a chance. Just what you don't know is that Jake Sullivan was a national champion on debating in the United States. And he has preparing all the Democratic presidential candidates for debate since 2008. So you have a possibility to show.
Okay, so first, thank you for raising Joe Nye, who was a giant and had influence on people all over the world, both personally and through his ideas. So thank you, Minister, for raising him. Joe Nye's idea of soft power was not that it's just a nice thing to do, so do it. It is actually to the advantage of a country to have ways of persuasion and influence beyond merely coercion and military threat. I believe that remains relevant today. And frankly, when we were going back and forth on the China question before, I think Beijing thinks that's relevant today. And in fact, is spending a lot of its time thinking, how do I now accumulate and deploy soft power in light of a very disruptive American administration? So no, I don't think that Europe somehow was wrong in thinking we have to be a cultivator of and a practitioner of soft power. Joe Nye also was a deep believer in the alliance system and in hard power. In fact, he didn't say soft power is better than hard power. He says you need both. And I think here, the big conversation in Europe today is how do we as Europe, build up hard power? And I think that there is a long road from here to there, but that is a worthy conversation in service of Europe's interests and in service, I believe, also of the transatlantic relationships interests as well. So the issue for me, the gap right now with respect to Europe's capabilities lie not in too much soft power, too much focus on soft power, because these are not trade-offable against one another. It's not hearing and seeing what Joe Nye was saying, really an effective player on the global stage requires both forms of power in considerable measure. In terms of reflecting on the loss, it's interesting, and you use the analogy of a boxer who got knocked out. In 2016, I actually worked on the Clinton campaign. I was foreign policy advisor. We lost that campaign. So that means I lost. I was part of losing that campaign. So my view of like how to take lessons from that was direct and immediate and distinctive. Here in 2024, I was national security advisor. So insulated from politics. My wife ran for office, was elected to Congress, and I was told when I could and could not clap for her at her events. And I was not allowed to prepare food for fundraisers, but I could shake people's hands when they walked in the door. And so I was not allowed to participate in any way in the campaign. So what generated Donald Trump's victory at the ballot box in 2024? What generated Kamala Harris's defeat? I think there are a number of things, many of them kind of outside of my realm. So what I have to do in part is think, okay, what was it, as far as the boxer defeated piece goes, what is it in the foreign policy domain that was salient to the Electoral College victory of Donald Trump? That's a complicated question I will reflect on this year and have plenty more to say as I did last time. I think I have actually shown my bona fides at staring square in the face of an electoral defeat and saying, we did this wrong and we have to change course. I'm not quite there yet on answering that question on the ballot box because we don't have all the data back yet. We don't know yet why people voted the way they did, and I want to be evidence-based before I make my decision. There's a separate question, which goes to the point about Gaza, or the question about Gaza, which is just leaving aside Trump winning, which had a lot to do with inflation and migration and other things. Just looking at your 4 years, like, what didn't you get right for America's position in the world, for the health of your country, for the security of your country? And there too, I'm trying to take a hard look at things. I'm actually going around and talking to a lot of people involved in Ukraine policy, which gets to the question that was posed by the gentleman from Ukraine on this issue of escalation risk and World War III and all the rest of it. Because the critique is, you guys really overvalued that. You should have discounted it much more, and that was a mistake. Core to that critique is the argument that if we had done something different, the outcome would have been different, i.e. Ukraine would have ejected Russia from all of its lands and Russia would have taken a knee and just gone away. I have not seen someone show the work on how that happens, but I'm trying to actually study that question, including with critics of President Biden's policy, so I can learn more, educate myself on it. So maybe I can come back next year and report on, on my findings on that. And then there's the Gaza question. It's interesting, what I've seen basically since the breakdown of the phase 1 ceasefire, 42 days into President Trump's term, so for the past more than 2 months, is basically a full-on siege of Gaza. No food, medicine getting in, and essentially a blank check to Israel, do absolutely whatever you want. I think this is affecting Hamas's calculus at the cost, grave and tragic cost in lives and security of the Palestinian people. But I think it is having an effect on Hamas. I do not think it is a good blueprint for American policy, though, for us to support such a thing. And we, came under a lot of criticism for not pushing the Israelis hard enough in various ways. But one thing I will say is I worked tirelessly as National Security Advisor to get more aid, humanitarian aid, into Gaza. We see what happens when someone isn't pushing, none gets in. And I do believe we were able to stave off famine in Gaza because of the work that American diplomacy did to get aid going in. That being said, the immense and horrific tragedy of Gaza obviously begs the question, what could or should we have done differently? And I lie awake at night thinking about this question. And I formulate a variety of different possibilities. And I try to work out, would that have generated a different outcome? And I don't have a clear answer yet. I'm not sure I'll develop one even. But I do not think there is an obvious, hey, blindingly, we should have just done that thing. And if we had done that, everything would have worked out much better. I don't think there's one of those, or at least I haven't heard it. But do I believe that we should continue to study and reflect to see how could we have improved our approach to save more lives, to reduce suffering, while protecting Israel's security? I will keep thinking about that for the rest of my life. And I would think anyone, with a conscience would do the same. And I will keep my mind open to someone coming forward and saying, if only you'd done this, then this would have turned out in a much different way. I've not heard that yet, but I'm not saying that it's not out there. Just one thing that I do take exception to, I think the question that was raised about how to think about World War III and the like was a fair and legitimate question. The suggestion that President Biden and President Trump have the same approach to Ukraine, and President Trump and President Biden have the same approach to President Putin, I do not think that is fair. I don't think that's borne out by the way in which President Biden mobilized an international coalition, worked hard against huge political obstacles to pass massive budgets of aid for Ukraine, flowed extraordinary amounts of weaponry to Ukraine, and stood firm behind Ukraine without giving preemptive concessions to Russia or taking Russia's side in the narrative on who started it or who's the obstacle to ending it. So I think that there's quite a big distinction between the two of them. On the China regime type question, I think it's a fascinating question. If China were a giant democracy 4 times the United States, would we still have the same view of them? The answer is to a certain extent, yes, because the US wants to be number one, because we're a confident, ambitious, dynamic country with people who want to compete in everything, in capitalism, in democracy, in sports. So of course we would want to be number one. Do I think the competition would be fundamentally different than it is now? Yes, because the stakes would be different, because the victory, or not victory, but another country prevailing or leading in a competition who has a totally different worldview and whose success to a certain extent creates new risks, dangers, and threats is different from a democracy just doing better. So I think it wouldn't mean the end of competition between the US and China, but the character of it would be considerably different if their country looked from a value system similar to ours. The Golan Heights, the question was, you say you can't seize territory by force, but you didn't reverse the recognition of the Golan Heights offered by the previous administration. This is true. One thing that I would say is a massive distinction between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how Israel ended up on the Golan Heights is how the war started that led Israel to end up on the Golan Heights, which obviously had larger implications, including, by the way, that Israel controlled Sinai for a long time before they turned it back. But basically, they were attacked by Syria, and they went and took territory. So I can understand the argument at a level of principle, but I think there's a pretty significant disanalogy there. On the question of, I found the comment fascinating that foreign policy was about values, domestic policy about interests, and President Trump has kind of flipped them. That's something I may steal going forward, if you don't mind.
Don't steal, borrow.
Borrow. Yeah, borrow. But I believe there still is a role for values in foreign policy. And one thing is a lesson I did not want to overlearn in 2016 or now, is the American people still do care about standing up to bullies, supporting the little guy. They still do care about the suffering of others and how to try to alleviate that. And many of the things President Trump is doing contrary to these impulses are deeply unpopular, and not just among Democrats, but across the board. So I agree that the role of interests and how it factors into American foreign policy has changed, and has changed to a certain extent among the public, but we cannot give up on the deep American impulse about a certain kind of way of being that I still think is present in 2025. That being said, this language question, you know, I think one of the biggest soul searchings that will happen over the course of the next 4 years for Democrats is going to be, how do we speak differently? How do we tell a story differently? How do we diagnose the problem differently? And then how do we serve up a solution, frame up a solution differently? So I believe there is a recognition that in narrative, in language, there is a disconnect with a lot of people who do not buy the old language or the old narrative, and it needs to be updated. I don't think the shape of what that is has yet come into view, but I certainly believe that it is a salient factor in the conversations happening within the Democratic Party today. And I actually think you're going to find the answer not in some room of Democratic leaders in Washington, but in candidates coming from local communities who are trying things out in a midterm election while saying, I don't really like those Democrats in Washington, but here's my view. And that is how you end up, I think, with a fresh message for a national candidate in 2028. My hope is that is what will happen. On the young people going into politics, I would point out that 3 of the last 5 Democratic presidents, Kennedy, Clinton, and Obama, were elected not to their first office, but to President of the United States in their 40s. And each of them had started political careers in their 20s or early 30s. So there is a long tradition of young people in the United States running for and achieving very high public office at a relatively young age. And in all 3 of those cases, without any other real career, substantial career they would had outside of politics before they went to get elected president of the United States. So that's certainly something that's available to young people. And the number one piece of advice I would give to young people for how to be prepared to be an effective leader today in a fast-changing, absolutely unpredictable world goes to another question which was asked is, have convictions and hold fast to those, but know the difference between convictions and opinions, and be prepared to change your opinion when you are presented with facts that are contrary to it. And changing your mind is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. And actually, I'll just give you an example of where the American national security community writ large changed its mind was on China. Was going from a consensus which said, bringing China into the rules-based international order will lead China to liberalize economically, which will lead it to liberalize politically. That was the consensus. And then people woke up one day and said, that didn't happen. In fact, one can look at certainly the actions of the last few months and say, we thought China's entry into the rules-based international order would change China, make China more like us. In fact, in some ways, it has made us more like China. And that's something I don't want to overstate that, but that's something to be contemplated. And then finally on small yard, high fence, a little bit of it kind of depends on where the story starts. If the story starts that the United States woke up one day and just said, you can't have this stuff, I would understand your question a little differently from my experience of it, which is Xi Jinping woke up one day, went out and said, we, China, are going to have a strategy. We're going to call it Made in China 2025, and we are going to spend our next decade basically making sure we are not reliant on the rest of the world for technology, and making sure the rest of the world is fully reliant on us for technology. That was the stated, not some secret thing we found through intelligence, that was the stated doctrine of China. So you're sitting there in America, and you're like, well, should we give them this very high-end technological capability that they could use for national security purposes against us or our allies? Well, no, thank you. I don't think we will do that. So that was really our reaction to an asserted strategy by China, which was not what was in place 15, 20 years ago. They chose to go down this path, and we responded to it. Now, I understand he started it, is good on the playground, is not great in international affairs. I'm not trying to say this to suggest we did this out of petulance. No, we took a hard look at the reality of China's policy, and we reacted. Now you ask the question, well, how will they react? Because now you've done this. Well, they have. They've taken steps on their own export controls to the United States on things like gallium and germanium and graphite and other things. And we'll have to contend with that and manage the respective actions they take and we take. But my view is we are trying not to decouple from China, but we are going to make sure that for national security applied technologies at the very high end of the spectrum, we're just not going to be in a position where they can go into China's military intelligence industrial complex and be used against us. And President Biden just said that flat out directly to President Xi when they met. This was he said, it's just very simple for us. This is how we look at it. So I don't know if I got through every last question, but that's my rundown of.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to tell you what I found most reassuring. A friend of mine recently asked me, do they know what they do? And with the case of Jake, at least, we don't know what he's doing is right, but at least we can be sure that he knows what he does. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.